Hello and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. But first, our Target Prelims 2022 crash course has begun on the Baiju's Exam Prep app from yesterday. And those of you who are preparing for the upcoming prelims, don't forget to download the Baiju's Exam Prep app in order to access the Target Prelims crash course. And very soon, we shall be launching the current affairs part of the crash course as well on our YouTube channel through live sessions. So, with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This article evaluates the current economic and political situation in Sri Lanka. As you know, we have been discussing Sri Lanka's grave economic crisis over the last few classes, and you might have even seen visuals of massive public unrest in the country, where people of all ethnicities and religions have taken to the streets and have been protesting against the political and economic mismanagement of the country by the Rajapaksa government. This public unrest, which has been triggered by the massive economic crisis staring at Sri Lanka, has kicked off nothing short of a political revolution in the country, and the people on the streets are demanding regime change as they directly hold the Rajapaksa government to be responsible for the economic and political mismanagement of the country. Since 2005, the Rajapaksa family has retained a strong hold over Sri Lanka's power structures, and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the current president, along with his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, the current prime minister and former president, along with few other members of the Rajapaksa family, have established an authoritarian centralized leadership in Sri Lanka when they were in power between 2005 and 2014, and even after they came back to power in 2019. The Rajapaksa family is said to have ruled Sri Lanka with an iron fist during these years, and they have established a strong authoritarian centralized leadership, which is largely being held responsible for today's economic mismanagement. It is said that the Rajapaksa brothers have often relied upon exploiting the religious and ethnic divides of Sri Lanka to help retain their stronghold over the power structures. During the initial term between 2005 and 2014, the Rajapaksa government exploited the Tamil Sinhala divide, and during the last phase of the civil war against the LTTE, it is said to have committed gross human rights violations against Tamil minorities. Along with this, the Rajapaksa government has been held responsible for promoting communal polarization in the country targeted against minority Muslims. And it is through such exploitation of the religious and ethnic divide of Sri Lanka that the Rajapaksa brothers held on to power by nurturing majoritarian sentiments, particularly that of the radical Buddhists. This political and social polarization in Sri Lanka contributed to the rise of the Rajapaksa brothers to power, and it directly contributed to the formation of an authoritative centralized leadership, which has not shown any inclination to uphold transparency and accountability. This focus on political polarization and majoritarian mobilization pushed Rajapaksa government to focus mainly on national security expenditure, which directly contributed to a bloated government structure along with unnecessary government and security related expenditure. Along with this, the Rajapaksa government developed a habit of taking irrational and unviable loans, especially from China, which pushed the small country into a debt burden. This took away the focus of the Sri Lankan government from domestic production and the domestic economy, and as the local economic factors were ignored and neglected for years, and as government corruption and mismanagement kept increasing under authoritarian centralized leadership, the foundation was laid for the collapse of the Sri Lankan economy. Apart from this, the Sri Lankan government took several controversial decisions. For example, it made an overnight switch to organic farming and banned the usage of artificial fertilizers, which ended up taking a huge hit on Sri Lankan agriculture. Along with this, the pandemic and the lack of incoming tourists deprived Sri Lanka of its precious revenue, eventually leading to its complete collapse as it ran out of its foreign exchange reserves. So, without sufficient forex reserves to continue imports, Sri Lanka was staring at a sovereign default on its loans and repayments and is on the path to complete bankruptcy as a direct result of the complete mismanagement from its government. This grave economic crisis has led to the suspension of essential services in Sri Lanka, and this has triggered massive public unrest from all sections of the Sri Lankan society, and people have poured onto the streets, forgetting their ethnic and religious divides. And in one unified voice, they have been protesting against the Sri Lankan leaders, calling for their removal. In an unprecedented development, the entire Sri Lankan cabinet resigned, and even close political allies of the ruling party withdrew their support to the government, and this led the Rajpaksa brothers to offer the formation of a multi party cabinet in order to revive the country out of its crisis. But this offer has been rejected by the opposition parties as well, as they first want accountability to be fixed for the economic crisis that the country is experiencing. So, politically, the Rajpaksa brothers have been isolated even by their own allies and by their own party members. And hopefully, it is the right time and opportunity to put Sri Lanka back on the road to economic recovery and as well as on the road to political and social recovery. Because there exists a direct connection and a link between the two. As long as the society is divided on ethnic and religious lines, majoritarian politics will keep getting promoted and will always lead to the formation of centralized authoritarian leadership, which in turn breeds corruption, excessive government expenditure, and lack of accountability. So essentially, Sri Lanka is at a crossroads as of now. If Sri Lanka were to continue on its previous path, it is going to push the country towards more suffering, as most likely Sri Lanka will witness a complete sovereign default and bankruptcy. But if Sri Lanka wants to take the path to recovery, then there has to be a complete political and social overhaul, which should give rise to the formation of a credible and accountable government. So it is time for the Sri Lankan society to keep aside their differences, that is largely ethnic and religious differences, and majoritarian politics of the radical Buddhists will have to be cast aside, and the targeting of Tamil minorities and Muslim minorities has to stop. Followed by this, a responsible and inclusive government has to be formed, which is not only credible and legitimate, but should also be accountable to the people, and should quickly implement an economic recovery plan based on taking bridge loans from international lending institutions such as World Bank or IMF. And to deal with the existing debt burden, the external debt will have to be restructured by working closely with countries such as India and China. Sri Lanka will have to rely on this external support from India, China, and global financial institutions to come out of this crisis. But that would only be a temporary solution. If it needs a permanent solution, then the government will have to focus on establishing macroeconomic stability by focusing on core economic indicators such as containment of inflation, revival of local domestic production, currency stabilization, and a credible long term path to repay Sri Lanka's debts. But this long and difficult road to economic recovery will not happen without political and social change in the country, and hence it is up to the people of Sri Lanka to cast away majoritarian politics and call for the formation of a new government that is credible and accountable. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, written by PDT Achari, the former Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, in which he makes a strong argument for strengthening secularism in India in order to save the Republic. He argues how India, the modern Indian state, has always been inherently secular and highlights the principles of secularism that are enshrined in the Indian Constitution. He makes this argument in the context of recent developments where majoritarian intolerance has been on the rise in the country, where majoritarian religious groups particularly seek to be targeting various religious practices of the minorities. These alarming developments not only go against the Indian Constitution and the ethos and principles of our freedom struggle, but it also runs contrary to the ethos and principles of the Indian civilization itself. Because the great Indian civilization has always been a land of religious tolerance. It has accepted different faiths, allowed different religions to flourish, and eventually different religions and faiths were integrated into the Indian society itself, thus giving birth to a beautiful, diverse, multi-religious society. It is based on these civilizational ethos and philosophies that the Indian Constitution was drafted by our founding fathers. Thanks to the ideologies and vision of Indian leaders like Ambedkar, Sardar Patel, Nehru, and the others who led India's freedom struggle, a strong and solid foundation was laid for the modern Indian state that was based on modern liberal values, which were drawn not just from the European context, but were also based on the civilizational ethos and principles of the Indian civilization itself. Religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, and the others have always propounded equality and fraternity, and even other religions such as Sikhism, Islam, Christianity, and the others have all uniquely contributed to the emergence of a multi religious, multicultural society. So, this aspect of religious tolerance has been inherent to the Indian society, and the Constitution codified these principles by not just providing for equality and fraternity, but also by providing for a secular state where the state has absolutely no religion, whereas complete freedom of religion is granted to the citizens. This clear distinction has been provided in the Constitution not by accident, but as a part of its design to ensure that the state always remains free from any religion, whereas the citizens enjoy complete rights to practice the faith and religion they want. Generally, it is argued by constitutional and legal experts that the Indian concept of secularism is different from the European concept of secularism. In the European context, secularism is interpreted as a complete separation of state from religion, where the state and religion are seen as two separate, isolated entities. In the Indian context, it has often been said that this European interpretation of secularism does not apply, but instead, Indian secularism refers to the equal protection and respect for all religions. But the writer takes a stand against this interpretation of Indian secularism because, according to him, this is what has diluted secularism in India. He argues that in the name of equal protection for all religions, government leaders and politicians, they not just wear religious clothing and participate in religious rituals and ceremonies, but they also explicitly demonstrate their faith in the public, which ideally should not be the case in a truly secular republic. Because, as stated, the state has no religion, and the representatives of the state should also stay away from associating themselves with any religion or religious practices. Whereas citizens, on the other hand, should have complete freedom to practice the religion and faith they want. But because of this diluted interpretation of secularism, state representatives have often indulged in openly displaying their religious faiths and practices, whereas on the other hand, the religious rights and practices of citizens is curbed, thus leading to the violation of the basic structure of the Constitution. He provides a reference to a few fundamental articles to argue how the state should have no religion as per the Indian Constitution. See, according to Article 27, no tax can be levied for promoting any particular religion. This clearly restricts the role of the state in religious affairs. Because, in other words, no public revenue is permitted to be spent in favor of any particular religion. Then, according to Article 28 of the Constitution, no religious instruction shall be given in educational institutions which are wholly maintained out of state funds. The purpose of this article again is to keep the state away from religion, especially when it comes to delivering religious education through state funds. The same article says that no educational institution, recognized or aided by the state, shall compel or force any person to attend religious classes or worship. The idea again is to ensure that no citizen is forced to follow religious practices in schools that are funded by the state. Then, according to Article 25, Clause 2, subsection A, the state has been empowered to regulate secular activities associated with religious practice. And of course, we have Article 15 that prohibits the state from discriminating against the citizens on the grounds of religion. So, when you read these articles together, it becomes very clear that the Indian state cannot be associated with any religion, and the state in itself should not display any inclination towards any religion. This stand was reiterated by the Supreme Court as well in the Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case, where the Supreme Court ruled that the state shall have no religion of its own. It is this principle of Indian secularism that has held the Indian Republic and the Indian nation together, as it keeps away majoritarian tendencies and prevents the country from turning into a theological state. In our neighborhood itself, we have seen the fate of our neighbors which turn towards religion and theocracy. Take the example of Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. All these countries have faced long periods of political instability, social violence, autocratic rules and dictatorship, along with riots, violence, and civil wars. And they were a direct result of these states turning towards theology, where the state associates itself with a religion and starts governing the state on the basis of theological principles and religious practices. So, the writer's strong argument is that in India, secularism has to be strengthened because if India as a nation has to survive, it can only survive as a secular state. Only when the state has no religion and only when the state is not involved in promoting any religion, only then can a multi-diverse, multi-religious society like India can survive, thus highlighting the fact that the principle of secularism is the bedrock of the Indian constitution. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6 that evaluates India's position on the Russia-Ukraine war. The editorial first appreciates India for taking an independent stand on the Russia-Ukraine conflict in line with the foundational principle of Indian foreign policy, which is the principle of strategic autonomy. It is this principle which guides the independent and autonomous foreign policy choices of India, which are designed to fulfill India's national interests. So, keeping India's national interests in mind, the government chose not to target Russia by siding with the Western countries. And India not only didn't criticize Russia for its military aggression against Ukraine, but it also abstained on any UN vote which was targeting Russia. Along with this, India has chosen to bypass Western economic sanctions that have been imposed against Russia, keeping in mind the importance of Russian energy and defense supplies to India. So while this stand of India has protected India's national interests vis-a-vis Russia, it has been equally important to protect our national interests with regard to the Western countries, particularly with regard to our close relations with the US. Western countries led by US and European Union have definitely been unhappy with India's position, but India has tried to placate them by calling for a peaceful resolution to the conflict through talks and negotiations. But the Western countries are not impressed with India's stand, and several of their top officials and diplomats have visited the country in the recent weeks to put pressure on India in order to influence its position, in order to pull India away from this indirectly pro-Russian stand. In this regard, the Western countries have been bringing up three particular points with India. One, they have been trying to convince India to vote against Russia at the UN. Two, they are trying to discourage India from purchasing discounted Russian oil. And three, they are trying to convince India to not enter into a rupee-ruble payment system, which will allow Russia to bypass the Western sanctions. On these aspects, India has rightfully not budged and has continued maintaining its independent foreign policy in line with the objective of protecting its core national interests. But this position may no longer help India, and it might severely dent India's image as a democracy and as a country that protects and upholds human rights, given the fact that reports are emerging from Ukraine of gross human rights violations being committed by Russian military. Reports are pointing towards possible war crimes and even a genocide. And if more evidence were to come up that substantiates these allegations against Russia, then it would be very hard for India to continue maintaining the same position. Because India cannot be seen backing or supporting a country which is committing war crimes and indulging in a genocide. And it is in this context that the editorial is asking India to fulfill its responsibilities as a non-aligned democracy by choosing to criticize Russia where it is needed, while continuing to maintain its independent position without falling under the pressure of the Western countries. These issues are definitely going to dominate the upcoming 2+2 ministerial talks between India and US. And India will have to be mindful that Russia is going to be cornered even more at the global level as these serious allegations of human rights violations get stronger day by day. And India will have to come up with a better response in order to protect human rights by criticizing Russian actions where it is needed. Or else, India will run the risk of getting isolated at the global level, and India could be bracketed in the league of Russia and China. There are indications that the US and the Western countries are going to further step up their sanctions against Russia in the light of allegations of war crimes, and they are even considering to boycott Russia at the G20 along with seeking Russia's suspension at the UN Human Rights Council. So India will have to anticipate these developments. And while it is justified in protecting its national interests by maintaining an independent policy, it will have to remain consistent on this principle as India has a strong commitment for democratic and human rights. And if prima facie Russia appears to be committing war crimes, then India will have to slightly change its position to criticize Russia and target Russia on a case to case basis. Fortunately, India already appears to be doing that, according to this article on page number 13. India has condemned the killings, that is, civilian killings that have been reported at Bucha on the outskirts of Kiev, where reportedly hundreds of civilians have been killed brutally, and the fingers are pointing towards the Russian military. The Bucha killings have become a gruesome reminder of the atrocities that Europe witnessed during the Second World War under Nazi Germany. And in fact, in the West, parallels are already being drawn between Nazi Germany and Putin's Russia. In this regard, India has done the right thing by condemning the killings at Bucha, and India has called for a transparent and independent investigation to find out whether war crimes and civilian killings were carried out by the Russian forces. And based on these findings, India will have to change its position slightly to ensure that it is not seen by the rest of the world to be backing a country that is involved in war crimes and in committing genocides. This is where India will have to act according to international law, and as per its commitments under the UN Charter, India will be justified to criticize Russia as well, based on these individual incidents that are being reported, while it continues maintaining a broader independent policy towards Russia by keeping away Western pressure. Now let's take up this column from page number 7. On the occasion of the UN International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, two top UNESCO representatives have written a column in The Hindu, arguing for making sports accessible to all, especially to the disadvantaged, such as women, and to those who are differently abled. See, generally, sports is seen as a great enabler to promote equality and inclusiveness. That is the reason why sports happens to be at the heart of UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially with regard to goals related to education, health, and equality. Out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals under Agenda 2030, sports has been given a high priority under the targets for education, health, and equality. Because the sporting success of a country can help in breaking social barriers, thus leading to overall equality and inclusiveness in the society. But this has been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns, as access to sporting facilities and training centers have become restricted and limited. And such restrictions always adversely affect the disadvantaged, such as women and those who are differently abled. Along with this, declining government budget and government allocation for sports and training also adversely affects the disadvantaged, because the disruption caused by the pandemic and the lower government spending on sport facilities and training will aggravate the existing social and cultural barriers in sports. Even in sports, a specific bias is noticed against women athletes and as well as against athletes who are differently abled. Prevailing social stereotypes and the gender-based stigma and inequality that exists makes it difficult for women athletes to pursue their dreams and ambitions. This is also true for the differently abled athletes, and these problems are compounded for women athletes who are differently abled. Hence, the authors are arguing for making sports more accessible based on the principles of equality and inclusiveness. They're calling upon the government to lead a transformational shift in India's sporting culture so that social stigmas and stereotypes and cultural barriers can be fought and overcome through the right government policies and initiatives, along with providing adequate resources and budget for improving sports training and facilities at the grassroots, especially at the school level and community level. And to help India in this regard, UNESCO has launched the Fit for Life flagship initiative, which will align with similar initiatives of the Indian government, such as Fit India campaign and Khelo India campaign. The writers are hoping that, with UNESCO's support under the Fit for Life initiative, further impetus can be added to the initiatives of the Indian government, such as Fit India and Khelo India, which can help in transforming sporting policies and facilities, especially for training at the grassroots, so that equitable and inclusive access can be ensured for women athletes and for athletes who are differently abled, not just to guarantee their sporting success, but also to aid them in their fight against social and cultural barriers. Then, coming to the last article on page number 13, Germany has shut down a Russian darknet marketplace known as Hydra. The darknet happens to be the hidden part of the internet, which has become a hub of illicit activities and organized crime. Due to the highly secure and anonymous nature of the darknet, it has become a flourishing ground for criminals who are involved in cyber attacks, data theft, along with identity theft, frauds and economic offenses, arms and drugs trafficking, along with human trafficking, prostitution, and child pornography. On the darknet, one of the largest marketplaces was known as Hydra, which is reportedly owned by shadowy organizations from Russia. This was said to be the biggest marketplace on the darknet, with the highest annual turnover worldwide, which was in the range of 1.23 billion euros. This darknet marketplace known as Hydra has been shut down by Germany by targeting the Hydra servers in Germany, and reportedly German authorities have seized bitcoins and other digital assets worth around 23 million euros. The reason why the darknet becomes a hub of such criminal activities is because the darknet provides for complete anonymity, as access to the darknet is highly restricted through high levels of encryption, and those who operate on the darknet access it through the Tor network or the Onion router, which is essentially a highly encrypted network that allows the user to mask their identity and location, thus allowing them to become completely anonymous on the darknet. So this leads the darknet to emerge as the hub of criminal activities, including terror financing, along with enabling communication between terrorists and promoting money laundering, and thus the darknet becomes a hub of criminal activities. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: Sri Lanka's economic crisis has amplified its social and political divisions. Examine. The second question: India as a nation can survive only as a secular state, where the state has no religion and does not promote any religion. Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.